Hey, Thriving Farmers. So I am on here with William, and William is sharing all about fungi and farming. And William, tell us a little bit about your current company and kind of like your current passions and what's going on.
Right on. I operate Mycosymbiotics and I cooperate Cognitive Function, which is a uh, company that produces food as medicine products featuring the mushrooms that we grow at Mycosymbiotics. Mycosymbiotics is more of a research and production business. So I do a lot of work in the field and in the lab and developing techniques that I share during classes that I teach around the country. And we also produce a fair amount of gourmet and medicinal mushrooms, both for our cognitive function product line and for local restaurants and resorts.
Very cool. Now, right now, you're focused more on the cordyceps, which is more the medicinal side, but you also have a grow room that you do like the lion's mane and all that as well.
Yes, yeah. I have a special grow area specifically for cordyceps mushrooms, and then I have a shed outside that's outfitted for production of gourmet mushrooms. I have operated larger scale gourmet mushroom fruiting rooms, but for the current work that I'm working on, I've focused more on cordyceps and just produce those mushrooms for our restaurants and resorts, and for in the resort and for fulfilling our needs for mushrooms.
Very cool. Very cool. So yeah, William, when you're ready to get started, go for it.
All right. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and get into it. So the way that I've approached mycology is from a home standpoint, a low tech standpoint. So I always want people to feel comfortable. I lead classes very often, a couple times a year from my home. I'm getting people hands-on skills with learning how to take a mushroom from spore or from the wild to producing it themselves. So I always want people to feel comfortable in the fact that you don't need a lot of equipment or you don't need a lot of background training to begin cultivating mushrooms. So I found that teaching from my home really kind of solidifies that idea, and then a lot of people feel confident in the fact that they could do it from their home as well. And even children can do it. So we have, I believe she was 10 years old in this picture. We had a 10-year-old at one of my classes, and she was cloning cordyceps mushrooms. So really, you don't need much technical skill or much background to be able to start working with mushrooms. And now I do know a lot of kids that are in high school that have very successful mushroom grows, which is really cool to see more young people getting involved.
Because it's not that hard, is what you're saying.
No, it's not that hard to grow mushrooms.
Yeah. And
Um,
that previous picture you're showing on the right there, is that actually where your cordyceps grow is?
no, this was one of my old labs. So any of the jars or anything that you see on those shelves are just in an incubation stage before
Ah,
they put into a fruiting room. Yep.
very cool.
Yep. So here we have one of my old grow spaces. This was in a basement, and the walls were covered with plastic film to make sure that I was protecting my mushrooms from the walls, and that I was also protecting the walls from the humid environment that the mushrooms require. It's really good when you're working in basements or spaces with concrete floors that have drains in the floor, so that you can spray excess moisture into the room and be able to have it go down and drain instead of it being pulled up. Um, Whenever I first started growing mushrooms, I really didn't have any funds. Personally, I dropped out of high school and had a child very young, so there's a lot of odds stacked against me as far as developing economic wealth or developing any sort of finances. So I didn't really have anything to spare when I started, so I had to figure out how to do it with no money, basically. So I ended up using a lot of space from family members and things like that, and the equipment that I used was oftentimes something I found on Craigslist or something that was really cheap. So this is the reason I bring this up is because you can see the mushrooms are hanging from ropes from the ceiling, and this paracord is uh, way cheaper than buying these racks in the back. Those racks can be anywhere from $40 to $100 per unit, and if you just get one rope of paracord, you can hang just as many mushrooms as you'd be able to hang on six or so of those shelving units. And this worked out really well. Oftentimes, we'll tell people I'm a graduate of YouTube University because I've used YouTube to learn most of the things. And on YouTube, there's a lot of videos from third world countries where they're growing mushrooms, or Southern Asian countries where they don't have as much funds to be putting into their grows. So you see a lot of innovation like this. I mean, a lot of the large scale mushroom farms do a lot of really innovative techniques in the that can be utilized in a more low tech type methodology. Um, Another thing to note about this picture is that I'm growing two different types of oyster mushrooms, and oyster mushrooms are very diverse and capable. One of the reasons that oyster mushrooms are so commonly cultivated is because they've adapted to grow in every non-freezing climate on the planet, which means there's an oyster mushroom for every temperature range. So you can see my friend there is wearing a jacket because it's cold outside, and I'm growing oyster mushrooms that will grow when it's cold outside. So I'm not spending as much money on utilities to keep the temperature at a certain range. I just switch my mushrooms that will grow colder in the winter and warmer in the summer. And yeah, we do add a lot of humidity, and mushrooms do need a lot of fresh air. So you're going to want access to some sort of window for exhaust, or maybe ducting to outside for exhaust, and filters for bringing in clean air. Doesn't have to be anything too complicated. And for small rooms, I'll use like classical humidification systems that you can get from a pharmacy for your room, and to larger farms where I'll design my own humidification systems using pond foggers and fans.
Oh, very cool. Now, so in the catalog, do they talk about the temperature ranges? So you could just go into the catalog and for the winter, pick the mushrooms that do better in the winter time?
Yep, there's all sorts of places to source your cultures from, and typically they will have a lot of information about the strains that you're going to want to grow. Also, there's a lot of books like Organic Mushroom Farming and Microremediation by Trad Cotter. There's Paul Stamets books. My friend Willoughby released a book on mushroom cultivation, and then there's also Radical Mycology. So there's a lot of books that have tons of information on which strains, what's their ideal growth conditions, and things of that nature. So there's a lot of other things that can help you figure that out. So here's just a close-up of the mushrooms, and they're growing very well in that space I was utilizing. Eventually, I expanded out into a larger space and could afford all of the racks, and completely outfitted the grow in the way that I wanted to produce large amounts of mushrooms. And this picture was about 4 days before this picture, and I have this on my YouTube channel. And says something along the lines of 250-pound mushroom harvest. I was able to get 300 pounds utilizing about half of an 18 by 20 room. So I could have definitely produced more if I filled out the entire space. But you can produce ridiculous amounts of mushrooms per week without that much space. Especially if you stagger when you put your mushroom bags into your room. You can have it so every week you're harvesting a couple 100 pounds, depending on your scale of things, maybe a couple 1,000 pounds. Just depends on how easily you're able to distribute your mushrooms and what's the demand and all of that.
Two quick questions on this. So like when you just said putting them in staggered, when you first put them in, could you put them in closer because they're not about ready to fruit? And then as you know they're getting closer, start spacing them out a little further?
You're going to want to give them an ideal amount of space from the beginning. You don't want to start messing around and moving things, especially if they're starting to produce small mushrooms. It's really easy to break them off on accident.
Okay.
You're going to want them spaced out ideally. When I say stagger, I mean I'll fill up one rack with mushrooms 1 week, and then the next week I'll fill up another rack. So by the time that the first one's producing, I have more that will be producing the next week. So I know that there's not going to be a week where I'm not able to fill my orders because I put them all in at the same time or waited too long between putting more in.
How often will they fruit off the same bags?
Mushrooms, typically in commercial settings, will fruit them 2 or 3 times off of the same bags. A lot of farmers will just produce twice and then get rid of the bags, maybe throw them outside, things like that. And I have some slides where I can talk to you guys a little bit more about how to incorporate these into your garden and how to get them to grow well outdoors.
Very cool. Now, plastic versus metal racks. I see you're doing completely plastic.
The metal racks will start to get rusted over a long period of time just due to the humidity in there.
Okay.
ideally you would have some racks with wheels so you can slide them in and out of the grow room, move them around, and then also spray them down to clean them. But the metal racks are also then more expensive.
Gotcha.
So some of the other mushrooms I grow besides oyster mushrooms, we have these lion's mane mushrooms, which are becoming very popular because of their nerve growth factor and their neurological regenerative properties. So a lot of people are seeking these out for brain health. These are another mushroom that is very easy to grow. You really don't have to put much effort into it. If you have a healthy culture or spawn, which is what's in the bags is the actual body of the mushroom. The mushroom is just a fruit. So if you have a healthy body of the fungus, it will produce these mushrooms without you even trying. They'll just grow all over themselves. So really good candidate for growing, high value mushroom. Depending on where you're at, the prices are very different. I mean, if you go into New York City, if you go down to Miami, those are some of the highest prices for mushrooms I've seen in the US. Where I live in Pennsylvania, it's going to be a little bit less just because there's such big farms here. But this is a great candidate for working with as a beginner mushroom farmer. And this Hericium mushrooms, they'll grow on sawdust like the oyster mushrooms, and I'll get into that a little bit more as we proceed. So that's my boy with the lion's mane mushrooms. It's really good to get children involved, and they'll definitely teach you a lot. There's a lot of things that they'll think about that you won't think about, especially if you feed them the mushrooms too, so they're nice and smart. Here we have Foliota adiposa. This is a chestnut mushroom, another great mushroom to team with in cooler temperatures. This mushroom can fruit around 55, 65 degrees, again on sawdust. It's a very beautiful mushroom. You can add a lot of value to what you're bringing to market by cultivating different unique mushrooms. Has a nutty flavor, and you can eat the entire thing, cap and stem. Here we have the shimeji mushroom, and this isn't how people typically grow these mushrooms. This was one that was grown in a high CO2 environment, which is interesting to note that mushrooms do need fresh air and they produce CO2. So if you keep all your mushrooms in a closed room, they're going to be very stretchy because they're going to be looking for fresh air. But this is a cool thing to manipulate with mushrooms that have a very tasty and tender stem, like these shimeji mushrooms. To let them grow with long stems so you can kind of manipulate how they grow and provide something that people might have not seen before.
Very cool.
So this is my current grow room. This is in a shed. You can see that there's the plastic on the walls to help keep the wooden frame from getting deteriorated by the excess of moisture, also to keep the humidity in the room. And I mean, very simple. I don't need a really big grow space right now. In this space, I could produce 50 to 70 pounds a week. And I mean, that's completely ideal for the work that I'm trying to do right now. And you can see I'm just using this small humidifier, and I go in there once or twice a day with my hose on the mist setting and just mist all my mushrooms in there. And then I have a fan to help exhaust the CO2 and bring in fresh air that's running on a timer, so it turns off and on multiple times a day and keeps this at a perfect level of oxygen, and this room has been working out great for me all year. So as far as taking your mushroom material after you've grown it, you've produced a couple flushes or a couple rounds of production in your fruiting room, you can then take your mushrooms outside and do a couple things with it. So some people just throw all of their mushrooms in a big compost pile and forget about it. What I like to do is take a bunch of the same species of mushrooms and bury them in and mix them in with wood chips or compost or different things like that. So that's what we did with these gold oyster mushrooms in one of my old grow spaces in Lemoyne, Pennsylvania. And we took it and we mixed it in with the soil. And my friend that lives there, he takes his neighbor's lawn trimmings and leaf litter and wood chips from the neighborhood and coffee grounds from the local cafes, and he's always just adding that into his soil. And that has been feeding these mushrooms, which have been growing there for the past 4 years without any additional spawn added or anything. So these are going to become kind of a staple in his yard, flora, fauna, and fungi, for years to come. So every spring with the rains, these mushrooms come in and they produce in abundance. And we even plant in there. So he plants sweet potatoes in there, and the mushrooms still keep coming back every single year. So the mushrooms are increasing the rate of the degradation of the compost, which would have taken longer if he just threw it on there and didn't add anything. So it's breaking it down really fast. It brings in insects. The insects help break it down, and because he keeps adding more layers and layers of compostable materials, the mushrooms can keep growing up, and underneath them is finished soil that's rich in nutrients.
Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
And how many years did you say that's been going on for?
This one has been going on for 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
I see so many ways that vegetable farmers, or just most farmers in general, could use this with. And I know that also it will grow on like animal bedding too, correct?
So you're going to want to work with more of a soil mushroom for something like that.
Okay.
So we have mushrooms like the bluet, which would be Lepista nuda. We also have mushrooms like the wine cap, which is like the garden giant, the king stropharia. I like calling it the king stropharia because it's like one of the kings of degradation. You can turn wood chips into soil in like a year. Yeah, and one of my mentors, Trad Cotter, was featured in a chicken magazine a couple years ago for having the best smelling chicken coop that they had ever been to, because the entire bottom of his chicken coop had a layer of wine cap, the king stropharia spawn, growing throughout it, which is constantly eating the chicken waste and removing the smell, and then that's helping to produce really gigantic mushrooms.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So here we have maitake. This is getting into mushrooms that are a little bit more difficult to cultivate but have a really high dollar value. So this is some maitake that I grew in my grow room earlier this year, and we're working on some techniques to get these to grow outdoors. So hopefully that works out. But these are super amazing mushrooms, highly valued for their diffraction beta-glucan, for their immunomodulatory properties and anti-cancer values, and they're also very delicious. High-end mushrooms. So this is one that I'm trying to get locked in to be able to produce consistently all year. And it's also just very beautiful to look at.
Yeah. And what kind of dishes is that mostly used in?
Oh, I mean, this is used in very versatile ways. A lot of people use it as like a meat substitute. They'll do like vegan or vegetarian cheesesteaks with these, or mix them in with stir fries and soups and classical Asian cuisine. And I think there's a lot of potential for all of these mushrooms, just like a whole lot of different vegetables. Like all these mushrooms have different textures and flavors and smells, and they can add a lot to dishes. I like recently I've been blending a lot of mushrooms in the blender until it's almost like ground meat, and mixing it in with ground meat or sausage, and it adds a lot of additional moisture and flavor to the ground meats that I'm eating.
Very cool.
Yep. So here's the current grow shed. These are a couple of different grows from this year, where we have these big golden oyster mushrooms on the left that eventually I'd put out in the yard and would continue to grow outside. We also have these big, beautiful lion's mane mushrooms growing on the right. You can see how perfect and uniform these are, and again, high dollar value, both for selling them fresh or for dehydrating them and selling them dry for people to make medicine with. So the current industry in the United States, there are like some big farms like Host Defense, Paul Stamets farm, which produces mushroom products and mycelium products in the US. But most of the other large scale mushroom products are all coming from China. China produces about 70-80% of the world's mushrooms. I think there's a lot of room to be encouraging more farmers from the United States that are growing or that want to start growing. And my company, my partner and I have started a cooperative called Hive Mind. So anybody that's watching or anybody that's already growing, we definitely recommend growing medicinal mushrooms like this in bulk. And we can help you to distribute those to people that want to make different mushroom products. So there's a lot of different ways of selling the mushrooms, and I'll talk a little bit more about that moving forward. So some years ago, when I was first starting to get into farming and gardening and urban agriculture, permaculture, a lot of people told me, because one of my first big grows, I planted everything into wood chips. And a lot of people were telling me, you're not going to get anything out of this. The wood chips are going to take the nitrogen from your plants and all of this. And so I have this beautiful picture here where all of my plants seem to be very green and not in need of any nitrogen. And I planted these into entirely wood chips with a small amount of finished compost at the bottom. And then I added compost teas, but I literally planted plants into wood chips. And one of the reasons that this worked is because I inoculated the garden giant, the wine cap mushrooms, the previous fall in those wood chips. So from fall until I started planting, putting my plants in around April and May, the following year, the wine cap mushrooms had produced enough material for these plants to eat and be nice and healthy. So synergistically, they're working as the plants are providing shade for the mushrooms are providing nutrients for the plants. And then every time it rains or whenever I water my plants, I end up getting a bunch of these beautiful wine cap mushrooms that grow. And I can also take that to market or eat those with my vegetables and things like that. Yeah, they're very beautiful, rustic looking mushroom. They sell for a nice amount at farmers markets and restaurants and things.
Yeah.
And here we have another picture of the golden oysters growing right underneath some of our plants that we have there. We have some reishi that we grow outside. I'm really into growing mushrooms outdoors. That's where I'm going to move towards as I start to get access to more land over the next couple years, is more outdoor cultivation. Mushrooms do grow well indoors, but they grow better outdoors. It's way less energy intensive to grow mushrooms outdoors. You mostly just need to make sure that they stay moist. So by providing some sort of I don't want to say greenhouse because you don't need as much direct light and you don't want it to be so hot, but some sort of shade house, so to speak, to provide shade from the sun and to keep moisture in.
Now, one question on the water that you're providing. So let's say you're using water to mist them to keep them moist. Does that need to be pretty clean water? Because I know right now we're in the city and we have chlorine and stuff in our water.
That doesn't really matter. I use water right from my hose. I'm in an urban area. We're on city water. And I use water right from my hose for misting and all of that. I typically use rainwater in my substrate preparation. But if I'm in a pinch, I'll use city water and it works fine.
Okay.
I don't have any issues with that. Here we have a different style of cultivation. So log cultivation for people that actually have access to wood to cut down. Me living in an urban area personally, I don't have access to trees that I can cut down to be growing mushroom logs. But a really good candidate is ailanthus. I know a lot of people are having issues with ailanthus. And it grows really fast. It's also a soft wood that the mushrooms can break down really fast. But we can inoculate by drilling holes and introducing our mushroom culture into these logs. And this one is Pholiota Nameko. So some mushroom logs do well when they're semi-buried by wicking up the moisture from the ground. Some mushrooms grow really well if you bury the entire log, like reishi. If you inoculate it and dig a trench and put some rocks in the bottom, put your logs in there and then bury it, the mushrooms will grow really well right out of the ground. And then marketing. I mean, kids sell mushrooms better than adults. They're cute and people can't really say no to kids. So that's Leo a couple years ago at my farmer's market stand helping me to sell mushrooms. You can see we have a nice display. We have the lion's mane, shiitake, oyster mushrooms, and then I typically would add our value-added products that we make and other wild mushrooms that I've been finding to our farmer's market stand. So you can see here we have some chanterelles on the left, and we have some black trumpets and chicken of the woods on the right. So we always change up our display and had lots of things to offer. So we'll get into a little bit of mushroom biology. These terms are become more necessary when you're searching for wild mushrooms, but it's also important to know if you're going to be planting mushrooms outdoors to make sure that whenever you see mushrooms that they're the ones that you put there. So there's some things you're going to want to know about. A ring on the stem is a characterizing morphology. And that's something you'll see with the wine cap mushrooms. They're going to have rings on the stems. But you'll also see amanitas have rings on the stem, and those are toxic type mushrooms. So these are good things to know when you're dealing with mushrooms outdoors. Some mushrooms produce scales. Occasionally wine caps will produce white scales. Shiitakes produce white scales. Some mushrooms have an umbo, which is like a little nipple type thing on the top. Some mushrooms come out of eggs, like the amanita mushrooms or the stinkhorn mushrooms that occasionally grow in people's mulch. A lot of the mushrooms we're going to deal with have gills. Some of them have pores, like reishi. Some of them have teeth, like lion's mane. And again, these are more important when dealing with mushrooms that are growing outdoors. Mushrooms grow by producing spores. Spores are typically produced in the pores or the gills or the teeth. It takes 2 spores to create a whole new genetic. So they'll grow out fungal strands called hyphae, which are strands of single cells connected with each other. Eventually, they'll find a mating type that they're compatible with, and they will produce mycelium. Mycelium is the body of the fungus. It's what we think of when we think of fungus. And eventually, it'll eat all of the food that is available to it, or it'll become oversaturated with water, or some environmental a change will cause it to produce pins, which fill up with water and mycelium and eventually become a full-grown mushroom so that the life cycle can repeat itself.
So you're saying to get mushrooms, the fruit, normally it's some sort of stressor.
Yeah, it's either they ate all of the food that's available to them or they got way too wet. So if it rains a lot, it's like we're holding on to too much moisture. We need to release some of that, and they release it in the form of a mushroom.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yep. All right, so we're going to get into a little bit of just a walkthrough of starting your mushroom cultures to producing fruiting bodies. So I teach mostly low tech, no tech because it doesn't require a lot of technical skill. It's an important micro-resilience skill. It's something that can be done without a lot of equipment. It addresses low socioeconomic areas, so you don't need a lot of money to practice these techniques. It's efficient and it's good for teaching others as well. So each one, teach 10, get more of that information out there so more people have access to it. So step 1, you're going to need to obtain a culture. There's many ways to obtain a culture. I personally like the online forums on Facebook where I can communicate with a lot of people, see what they're growing, and then trade cultures like that. A lot of my friends have different websites where they sell liquid cultures or other mushroom cultures. You can find them sometimes at markets or different catalogs. Field and Forest has great mushroom cultures. Mushroom Mountain has great mushroom cultures. Smugtown Mushrooms has great mushroom cultures. I sell mushroom cultures. There's lots of different places to source your mushroom cultures. Spawn versus culture. So spawn will typically refer to a body of fungus fully grown on a substrate, typically sawdust or grain. This is preferred by many mushroom cultivators without labs. So a lot of people will just buy in grain spawn. We grow mushrooms on grains because they can be broken apart and recombined. So it only takes a couple cells of a mushroom to start a whole new fungal culture, or a fungus to start a whole new fungal culture. So when you think about that on grains, if you have a jar full of grains that has the fungus grown on all of them, when you break up those grains, each grain is enough to start to perpetuate the mycelium over again. So a lot of mushroom cultivators will just buy grain spawn and then they'll expand that themselves. Or they'll just buy the spawn and they'll put it in their fruiting room and produce the mushroom. So you don't always need to go through all of the steps of preparing the entire spawn for producing mushrooms. Cultures usually refer to a small living fungus growing on a petri dish or floating in aqueous solution or a slant. So some people sell liquid culture syringes, and that's a great way to go about it. And anybody wants to follow up on more information about that, you can definitely check out my YouTube channel, Apex Grower, where I have a lot of other videos specifically on these things. And then tissue culture refers to a sample of tissue, and that's typically done when somebody's cloning a mushroom. So on the left, we have these liquid culture syringes. That's what they look like. And on the right, we have petri dishes. I think moving forward, a lot more people are going to start working with liquid culture syringes as they are cleaner than petri dishes. You will need a clean environment if you intend on doing any lab work or grain expansion. So whenever I first started out, I just used a box with holes in it to create a still air environment where there's not mold spores flying around and things like that. where I'd wear gloves and I would do my clean work inside of the box. So that's something that anybody can do. And then on the right, I eventually built a HEPA filter, which would be constantly blowing clean air at me so I could do a lot of clean work in front of it. So not everybody needs to do these steps, but it's just something I want to mention for people that might be interested in doing these steps. And if anybody ever does want to get hands-on experience, stay tuned to my social media, or stay tuned to mycosymbiotics.net to see when we release new dates for the Urban Myco Design training course to teach people how to get hands-on experience doing this kind of stuff. So agar, this is how a lot of people start either spore cultures or start clones. I typically do 1 liter of coconut water to 25 grams of agar powder. That works out really well for me and creates like a little jello that you can grow your mushrooms on in petri dishes or in these little jars, whatever works best for you. For beginners, I definitely recommend the jars because you can put the liquid in and sterilize it, and you never really have to open it, whereas petri dishes, you're going to have to open and pour your agar into it to cool down. So if you're going to be doing lab work, you're going to need to sterilize your material, your grains, your agar, your liquid, whatever you're going to be using, you're going to need to sterilize it. So this is just a pressure cooker from Afghanistan. There's lots of different pressure cookers you can use. A lot of people say you only need to use like autoclaves or pressure sterilizers, but you can just use a simple Presto that you get. You can use
What about an Instapot?
yeah, you can use, that's the word I was looking for. You can use an Instant Pot. There's a lot of things you can use for doing sterilization and pasteurization, so it doesn't have to be too technical. So if you're going to be doing agar, once you sterilize your agar, it'll be liquid until it reaches about 100 degrees where it'll start to solidify. You're going to want to pour it while it's liquid and let it solidify in your dishes, and that's something you'll use for spore culture and for cloning and working with tissue culture. In the lab, you're going to need to keep your tools sterile, which requires some heat. So some people will use alcohol lamps or butane torches or machines like these or instruments like these, like the back incinerator. For cloning mushrooms, you're going to need to cut some tissue out of the inside of the mushroom and then transfer that into a nutrient dish of agar to let the mushroom mycelium grow back out so that you can make your grain spawn with it and then expand it out to grow in your fruiting room and things. So this is what it looks like under a microscope whenever you take a little bit of tissue from an inside of a mushroom and then the fungus grows back out of it. This is more microscopic pictures of fungal cultures growing on petri dishes. And this is what it looks like to the naked eye. So step 2 would be propagate myceliate. Once you have a culture, the next thing you would want to do is propagate it to a new substrate. So you can really grow mushrooms on anything organic. You can grow them on old cotton clothes. You can grow them on cardboard, paper, wood chips, coffee grounds. I stay away from hay and grass clippings because they get really hot when they're breaking down. But more like things that are rich in cellulose and lignin, like hemp stalks or grain stalks, corn stalks, ground up corn cobs. Think things like that are kind of woody like materials. You can really grow mushrooms on anything that you can imagine that's organic. So definitely keep that in mind. Propagation means to start from a parent culture, and it can take on many faces. Just like I said, you can grow them on so many different things in so many different places. We'll go on to this next one, which is sterilization and pasteurization. And just like I mentioned before, you can use all sorts of pressure canners, Instapots, whatever you have that can make a little bit of pressure and heat. There are a lot of low pressure, no pressure pasteurization techniques like pasteurizing with hydrated lime. This is something I do with straw, where I'll use shredded straw, submerge it in water, add hydrated lime to raise the pH, and then use it once the pH goes back down. It gives you a limited window. You can also do liquid fermentation, where you take straw or wood chips and just submerge them in water for a couple days, where all the bacteria that's growing on it will become anaerobic. So once you pull it out of the water, it'll be aerobic and they'll all die, which gives you a small window of time that you can add your mushroom culture without a lot of competition.
Okay, quick question on that, because that's fascinating to me, because that's the biggest thing that I've struggled with is, the whole pasteurization thing. With hydrated lime, so you lime it, then do you wash did they get the lime out, or is the lime just kind of?
Well, the lime goes back down in pH, and then it adds like a little bit of like calcium, or I don't know what other nutrients or whatever minerals are in it. Um, so you don't wash it. You just fill a barrel up with water, mix in your hydrated lime, and then come back to it the next day. The pH won't be high anymore. Pour out the liquid away from your garden because it can kill plants,
Uh-huh.
and then just put your mushrooms right into it and bag it up or put it in buckets or whatever you want to grow your mushrooms out of.
Very cool.
Yeah. There's like heat pasteurization, which I do with this barrel, and we have propane burners underneath it. That's a whole different thing that you'll need to be trained really to do, unless you feel confident enough to do it. It's not something you want to add pressure to, but that's something I talk more about in my classes. I don't recommend people try that without having seen somebody do it first. So then you get to expansion. Once you have your clean culture, once you've grown it on something, you can continue to expand it in a factor of 10. So if you have 5 pounds, you can expand that to 50 pounds of material. If you have 50 pounds, you can expand that to 500 pounds of material, and keep going in that way. And then slowly you'll see your culture start to grow through whatever material it is that you expand it onto. And then once you're at the point where you're like, typically around 5 pounds is a good amount of substrate to start producing your mushrooms from. And you can keep going up from there, and that just means you'll get more mushrooms. So I typically see people fruit from between 5 and like 50 pounds of substrate material. If you get too big and too wide, the inner core of your mushroom substrate is going to get hot and die. Um,
Okay.
yeah,
So you're
so it's
saying you can
something.
bag it up between 5 and 50 pounds, but if you get much bigger than that, the inside's just going to get rotted.
Yeah. So then fruiting, each mushroom has unique environmental preferences, but there are a lot of mushrooms that can grow under the same conditions, same temperature, same level of humidity. So I grow oysters and shiitake and lion's mane and maitake and a lot of other mushrooms at the same temperature and same humidity. Um, and then using skills like permaculture and biomimicry, you can just mimic the environmental conditions of wherever you found the mushroom, whenever you found it in the wild. That's something good to keep in mind. And then modular fruiting is ideal for starting out. Start small and then eventually expand. If you start too big and then have a lot of mistakes, it might keep you away from continuing. If you start small and then realize what potential mistakes you might have, it helps out a lot moving forward. Here's just one of my outdoor grow spaces. Whenever we're setting it up, it was just a outdoor carport. These work really, really well for fruiting mushrooms outside. You can outfit it with shelves or whatever you want to put in there, and literally just put a sprinkler or a mister from your hose in there and forget about it, and you'll just get lots of mushrooms. And just as an example of growing mushrooms on shredded newspaper. So for whenever I want to inoculate mushrooms outside, like the wine caps, I'll get a 5 pound block of it, and I'll expand it on paper and other like paper towel rolls and things like that until I have a lot more of it, and then I put it outside so I can do more space. Fungi are actively processing organic compounds into base elements in complex microbial societies, creating soils. So we can work with fungi and microherd soil organisms to recreate these processes and create soil at a rate that nature hasn't seen before humans. So, as most of us know, energy is captured by the sun, by plants, and converted into chemical energy, and then nutrient energy is absorbed and converted from the soil. The plants, they drop their leaves, they drop fruit, they drop dead, and allowing the fungi to thrive, allowing the energy to be released back into the soil, building these blocks of nutrient. So this is just what we're doing as mushroom farmers. We're taking this raw material that was collected by the sun, by plants, and by the nutrient energy that was already in the soil, and we're breaking it down and turning it right back into soil. I've probably produced like 6 or 7 tons of soil in my career of just growing mushrooms. So when we see mushrooms outdoors, there's typically a lot of insects, especially when they start to get rotten. So we can work with insects like red wiggler worms or with different beetle larvae to help us break down our wasted mushroom materials and turn those back into soil at a faster rate. And I've been really interested in with the beetles because there's a lot of people that are starting to farm bugs for human consumption. So and a lot of people that are farming the insects for human consumption are feeding them food that we could be feeding to humans, and there's too many hungry humans to be feeding human grade food to bugs. So we should be feeding them something that they can't eat, that we can't eat, like like mushroom sawdust material. So I found that a lot of the beetles can grow very well on eating spent mushroom materials. And the worms do really, really well whenever we take the worm tea that comes out of the worm composters and expand those microorganisms in a compost tea brewer. If we soak our mushroom blocks in that compost tea with those organisms, the worms can eat that way faster than if you were just to add the mushroom block on its own. So lots of little tricks and techniques for growing lots of soil. And at the end, you're going to have lots of very nutrient-rich soil that you can grow your plants in without having to add too much amendments. Last little bit, mineral mining with fungi. Minerals are essential to our health. A lot of topsoil has been, the minerals have been removed from monocrop agriculture. Rain washes things away. Growing the same plants over and over again takes a lot of those minerals out. So by growing mushrooms on sawdust, we're getting the minerals that the trees were able to access with their deep roots, and we can accumulate that. We can also add things like gypsum and azomite and things like that into our mushroom substrates to help make these minerals bioavailable for us. Yeah, if anybody's interested, definitely come out to our festival. We do a festival every year, Mycosymbiotics Mushroom and Arts Festival, or MycoFest, where we get lots of people together. This was from the second or third year. This year we celebrate our 5th year, and we find mushrooms every year. We cook lots of food. We hang out with each other. There's live music, camping, all sorts of things. We typically find over 200, 300 species of mushrooms. We usually find pretty rare mushrooms and document everything. Now we're doing DNA sequencing of our mushrooms to add those to the database. And we always have lots of fun and have lots of brilliant speakers that speak on all different topics around mycology. So this is a display table from one of the previous years before we broke everything down and identified all of it. And we typically do identify everything that we find. We have found a couple mushrooms that are undescribed by science, so that gives us the opportunity to put a scientific name on a mushroom, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really appreciate you having me on this, and I hope that people got good information out of this, and definitely check out my YouTube channel at Apex Grower, or check me out on Instagram at MycoSymbiote or MycoSymbiotics. We did change the website recently to mycosymbiotics.net instead of .blog. You can also check out mycoshop.net. But yeah, I really appreciate it, and I hope that everybody can propagate in myceliate.
Yeah, no, that was great. Couple questions I've got for you on that. You've also got a book out, a couple books out on cordyceps, correct?
Yes, I have one book out on cordyceps mushrooms right now, and I have another book that will be released in February. That's kind of the volume 2, so that'll be the one that people should go to, because it'll have everything in the volume 1 updated, because there are things that I didn't know or that changed. So volume 2 is coming out in February. That's going to be the one you want to go to. I also have a book out, an ebook out on algae cultivation. So aside from mushrooms, I do a lot of other things, including algae farming, which I think has a very bright future. And I think that's something that a lot of younger farmers or even older farmers in more arid areas might find a lot of benefit by researching.
Yeah, I actually, one of the speakers that's doing microgreens for the summit, so was talking about algae. And I was like, well, I know the guy. So I sent him your information. So
wonderful.
Yeah, and you're also doing sequencing too. And I just saw that you were at a DNA sequencing workshop in New York City.
Yes, yeah, I went to the New York Genome Center and took a class with Oxford Nanopore on next generation sequencing, high throughput full genome sequencing, which is a little bit different than what a lot of people are doing right now, which is just sequencing small regions of DNA for identification of species. But with full genome sequencing, there's a lot of benefit for farmers in a lot of ways. One, for detection of foodborne illnesses, finding the origination of the foodborne illnesses. 2, for understanding disease vectors early on. So we can find out within 48 hours if your plants are having any sort of disease, or if the insects are microscopic, or a virus or bacteria is something that we can't macroscopically identify. Within 48 hours, we can use these new technologies to sequence the entire genome and find out exactly what pests are becoming virulent in these farms. And there's a whole bunch of other new stuff that's coming out. I just saw an article. I can't remember what company. They did full genome sequencing on all these different heirloom tomatoes and literally read the DNA to find what parts of the DNA are attributing to the color, the flavor, the yields, and things like that, to kind of focus on that with breeding programs for creating the next non-lab genetically modified, but more of like human crossbreeding genetic modification.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that's a whole nother topic in its own. I mean, we humans have been creating genetically engineered organisms for years before technology. So there's two different ways of thinking about that.
Yeah. So you've also got the Hive Mind too, which is where you basically buy in the medicinal mushrooms and then resell those, or basically it's co-op kind of.
Yeah, it's the Hive Mind Co-op that we operate with Mycosymbiotics and Cognitive Function. Is kind of like our child organization, and it's really to help support North American farmers. There's so many big businesses that are buying millions and millions of dollars of mushrooms from China that are based out of the United States. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be supporting U.S. business, why we shouldn't be supporting U.S. farmers that oftentimes are struggling to make ends meet selling their mushrooms. We could be creating a whole new market for United States mushrooms. So that's what we're trying to do with our Hive Mind Co-op, and sell mushrooms, bulk mushrooms and bulk mycelium for anybody that's interested in using those for making products.
Very cool. Well, William, again, thank you so much for coming on today. People are going to absolutely love this. And yeah, I've got all the info, so we'll put that right below your talk so people can find their way right to you. Perfect. And yeah, thanks for your willingness to share again.
Yeah, my pleasure. I hope to be in touch again soon.